and family members who died at the hands of senseless, cowardly attackers. We pause to take stock of our policies and determine what more we should be doing to keep our community safe. And we pause to look forward and see what new threats lie beyond the horizon. We hope to be clear eyed about the world we live in and not give in to overhyped threats or miss the ones that do pose harm. And all the while, we strive to uphold our American values as we seek to secure our people and our homeland. The 9/11 attacks were a shock to American life, and today's events is a testament to the long shadow the attack continues to cast on many elements of our society, both large and small. As members of the Committee on Homeland Security, we have seen the full record of our response to the horrific events of 9/11, both good and bad. And I recognize the importance of documenting the stories of our successes and failures, our moments of overreach, over moments of hesitation, our moments of justice and injustice, and every other victory and setback along the way. That's why we are having this conversation today. In our discussion, we will take stock of these moments, including what we missed leading up to the attack, how we responded, how our institutions have changed, and how the American public has evolved to meet the challenges. I hope that our discussion today can be a useful contribution to our efforts to prevent future attacks. With that, I will turn it over to the ranking member of the committee, Mr. Kako, for any opening remarks.
Thank you very much for Ms. Barragan for standing in for Mr. Thompson, and thank you for the majority for holding this event. As we approach the 20th anniversary of the horrific September 11th attacks against our nation, I think it is important that we don't allow them to become a relic of the past. As the 9/11 Commission cited in its report, we can never again allow a failure of imagination in how we approach our national and homeland security. It's become instinctual to say, I remember where I was on that fateful day that shook our nation. Uh, in fact, uh, for many Americans, especially those from my home state of New York, the pain from the loss and devastation carries through to today. However, as each year passes and the attacks fall further into history, we risk forgetting the lessons we so painfully learned that day. We risk letting our guard down and making some of the same mistakes that led to the intelligence and information failure of September 11th. Sadly, I feel that the country has lost the American spirit we saw in the days, weeks, and months following September 11th, when we put aside partisan differences and worked together for the betterment of this great nation. Despite that, I still, Mr. Chairman and Madam Chair, believe that in both the best and worst of times, the spirit and determination of the American people will continue to act as a force of good in the world. Our nation is a beacon for freedom around the world, and it's up to us to keep it that way. Fortunately, I feel that this committee still upholds that spirit, and I sincerely appreciate that about our working relationships. I appreciate the partnerships and the friendships. Like me, I know you wake up every morning determined to make the homeland stronger. Next week, we will travel to New York City, truly hallowed ground. And I know that the committee also has other activities and events planned for this month to remember, commemorate, and continue to learn both new lessons and recapitulate the old. So again, thank you for holding this event today. I look forward to hearing from our panelists. And may I close by saying we can never forget 9/11, and we must continue to learn lessons from that time. If we don't, we are doomed to repeat it. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thanking Ranking Member Kako. We will now hear from our panelists who will have 5 minutes for remarks, starting with Dr. Byman, then Mr. Graff, Mr. Kojum, and finally, Dr. Ziegert. At the conclusion of the panel's statement, we will open it up for members' questions to have a dialogue. Now, we'll turn it over to you, Dr. Byman.
Thank you very much, and let me thank everyone for taking time out of their very busy schedules to listen to my thoughts and those of my colleagues. Uh, what I want to emphasize in my remarks is many of the post 9/11 successes. I believe these actually do not get enough attention. If you look at the number of people who have died in the U.S. homeland since 9/11 from jihadist terrorism, there are different ways to estimate this, but it's around 107 people. Now, that's 107 too many people. Let's be clear about that. But more Americans are going to die from COVID while this webinar is going on than have died from jihadist terrorism in the U.S. homeland since 9/11. And that, if you go back to the fears that many people expressed in their testimony before Congress, statements by President Bush and others, there was fear of mass terrorist attacks like 9/11 on a regular basis, and those have not happened. Um, and there's been quite impressive counterterrorism successes that, in my view, deserve credit. Some of this was the toppling of the Taliban government in Afghanistan. A lot of it was a broad campaign of intelligence and law enforcement around the world that made it very hard for groups like Al Qaeda and later the Islamic State to operate. Part of it was more aggressive FBI and Homeland Defense efforts at home. And part of it was the US drone campaign, which put a lot of pressure on these groups as well. But it's also worth pointing out that these groups are actually much more active in the Middle East than they were 20 years ago. So what we're seeing in many ways is a safer homeland, but a world where these groups exert more influence and where they're responsible for killing a lot more people, often in more dangerous forms of violence, such as civil war. And so we can say we have a mixed record on this. It's also, of course, been an incredibly costly and expensive record in terms of US efforts overseas. The Iraq War, which was unnecessary and not at all linked to 9/11, proved to be quite a negative from a counterterrorism point of view, destabilizing a country, giving rise to Al Qaeda in Iraq, which was the predecessor of ISIS. And now, after multiple administrations, the United States has left Afghanistan. And while I do believe the invasion of Afghanistan after 9/11 was vital, the subsequent drift in US policy has clearly been a negative and an incredibly costly one. When we're looking forward to counterterrorism, though, I urge members to think very strongly outside the jihadist framework. Far and away more dangerous in the United States has been right wing and especially white supremacist terrorism. I don't think I need to tell members of Congress the dangers that can be posed to political leaders, but the biggest danger, of course, is the impact on politics. One thing that was perhaps the only silver lining of 9/11 is that it brought Americans together in a truly special way. And I think many of us can remember the sense of solidarity we felt with our fellow citizens, the willingness to sacrifice. What terrorism has done in recent years has really divided Americans even further. And thus, when we talk about the danger of terrorism, we of course talk about innocent people being killed, but we also need to think of the political consequences and the impact of this. And this is something that I'm quite concerned with, and I urge both the members and staff to take this as seriously as possible in the coming years. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your remarks, Dr. Byman. Now we will turn it over to Mr. Graff.
Good morning. Thank you all for having me this morning. It's an honor to appear before the committee and speak about such an important day. I'm here as in my hat as a journalist and as a historian, someone who has spent most of the last 20 years covering and studying 9/11 and how it changed our world. And I want to take you back to that day and talk a little bit about its memory at this moment. As Representative Katko said in his opening remarks, this is a moment that all of us who were alive that day obviously remember, but that's increasingly not true for a growing chunk of the American population. 1/4 of Americans today are either too young to remember 9/11 or have been born after. And we stand 20 years after at the cusp of this event slipping from memory into history. And so I published a book 2 years ago, The Only Plane in the Sky, that was an oral history of 9/11, the way that 480 Americans experienced that day, morning to night, coast to coast. And I think it's so important to remember that day in oral history format to capture the human experience of that day. because as we learn about 9/11 in history books now, the story that we tell of 9/11 is a neater, simpler, and tidier history than any of us who were alive that day actually remember. We tell of 4 planes. We say the attacks started at 8:46 with a crash into the North Tower. The whole thing was over 102 minutes later with the collapse of the North Tower at 10:28 that morning. We talk of the Pentagon, we talk of Shanksville, we talk of the Twin Towers. But those of you who were alive that day, that's not the day any of us remember. We didn't know when the attacks began. We didn't know when the attacks were over. And worst of all, we didn't know what came next. And when I go back and I studied 9/11, what I was fascinated by was the most interesting moment of the day, the 17 minutes between the first crash and the second crash, 8:46 to 9:03. And in those 17 minutes, you see how different the country was before 9/11. You see a country that is innocent in ways that are unimaginable to us in 2021. I tell of Peter Johansson, the ferry captain of the New York Waterways ferry, coming into New York Harbor that morning, that they watched the crash as he was pulling into Wall Street Terminal that morning, and every passenger on his ferry got off and walked into Lower Manhattan while walking through the debris, the confetti, the ticker tape parade of paper and debris falling down from the North Tower. There wasn't a single person that morning on his ferry who looked at that crash and said, "Today just seems like it's going to be a bad day. I'm going to turn around and work from home." On Capitol Hill, I tell the story of Brian Gunderson, who some of you may know, who was the chief of staff to House Majority Leader Dick Armey that morning. He walked into his 9 a.m. staff meeting that morning, saw the crash live on television in the reception room of his office. And he said, "I thought it was going to be like a bad school shooting, the type of story that dominated national news but didn't actually change anyone's day." At the White House, Condoleezza Rice, the National Security Advisor, calls President Bush at Emma Booker Elementary School in Sarasota, Florida. They both have the same reaction. "Huh, that's a weird story. It must have been a small plane. Maybe the pilot had a heart attack. Maybe there was a mechanical problem." They agree to monitor the situation, and they both go on about their mornings. And that day, in that moment, you see just how innocent America was. And then at 9:03, we see the second crash, and we see the realization spread across the country that the world is now under attack, that the United States is under attack. And the short answer is it's important to understand that moment because of the emotion that it injected into US policymaking, the emotion that it injected into the White House, into Congress, and particularly the fear and panic of what came next. Because I would argue that as we look back over the last 20 years, there is a very mixed and dark legacy of the decisions that were made by the White House, the executive branch, and by Congress, the legislative branch, in the wake of 9/11. Because in many ways, America and the government panicked, and it led us to make a variety of policy choices that had long-lasting consequences, negative consequences, dark consequences that we saw as we governed a nation out of fear and not out of rational choices. We declared war not against a specific group that used identifiable specific holes in the US security blanket to carry out its complex attack, but launched a global campaign against nebulous terms like evil and terror, things that led us to make very poor and complex choices that we are still wrestling with 20 years later. So to me, that's the most important moment to understand about the legacy of 9/11 is the way that it made America afraid. And it changed the way that we lead our daily lives, both as policymakers and as citizens of this country. So I look forward to this discussion, my colleagues and their comments, and then the questions and conversation with the rest of you. Thank you so much for having me today.
Thank you, Mr. Graff, for your testimony. It does remind me of that moment that morning where my sisters were both flight attendants, one for American Airlines and one for United Airlines. And so that 17 minutes made a huge difference in the thought process. So thank you for pointing that out. With that, Mr. Kojum, we'll turn it over to you for your 5 minutes.
And thank you so much for the opportunity to be here. It is truly an honor, and I appreciate appearing with my distinguished colleagues. I'm going to make 3 points and 1 closing observation. And I've been in close touch with Governor Kaine and Congressman Hamilton, and I'm confident that my comments represent their views as I speak to you this morning. The first point would be in significant agreement with what Dr. Byman has said. The country is safer because of the policies and reforms that it undertook. Many of them were 9/11 Commission recommendations acted upon by the Congress and implemented by the executive branch over several administrations. The creation of a Director of National Intelligence, the National Counterterrorism Center, reforms to aircraft protocols, border security, international cooperation was vitally important. Dr. Byman mentioned this. I'd simply underscore this. All of these reforms and efforts have made the country safer. The record, of course, is not perfect. All of us remember Fort Hood and the Boston Marathon bombings and San Bernardino. Yet the broader point is that there was no repeat of 9/11. The country is safer. So what does this bode for the future? After the collapse in Afghanistan, well, we are prepared against worldwide counterterrorism threats, whether they're from Yemen or Somalia or Afghanistan. If we fund our institutions and keep our commitments to strong counterterrorism policies, we have every prospect of keeping this country safe. Of course, time will tell with that. The second point I would want to make is one of the Commission's recommendations with respect to congressional reform. And in some sense, I am pretty confident I'm speaking to the choir here. Strong executive branch agencies require strong congressional oversight. And Governor Kaine and Congressman Hamilton would sure like to see this committee in both the House and the Senate, the Homeland Security Committees and the Intelligence Committees strengthened and with exclusive jurisdiction over their respective cabinet departments and agencies. Now, I know chairs past and present of this committee have been working in that direction and have made some headway. More work needs to be done. And the point here is a simple one. This committee should be as powerful as the armed services committees. You ought to be passing an authorization bill into law every year because that gives you power to do your job in terms of oversight and reform of the executive branch. No executive branch is perfect on its own. It's only through the process of your oversight and watchdog activities that we can help to perfect our policies. The third point I would make is that, as the Commission said, military actions are important, but political and social reforms are also important as part of our counterterrorism policy. Governor Kaine and Congressman Hamilton participated in a study by the U.S. Institute of Peace on extremism in fragile states. The Congress passed the Global Fragility Act. That will be an important tool for us for counterterrorism going forward. Our military is extraordinarily capable at finding and destroying threats. Rebuilding societies is a different proposition. It's much harder, takes time, isn't always successful, as Afghanistan shows. Yet, a policy of prevention and working with fragile states is far less costly than military intervention. It takes time and patience, and that's not easy. it holds the prospect of better outcomes over a longer period of time. Finally, let me just close with a point I know that Governor Kane and Congressman Hamilton would make, and that is the essential nature of bipartisanship and nonpartisanship in facing these issues. As Dr. Byman and I both know from our life as 9/11 Commission staffers, it was a politicized environment. There were lots of arguments, and at times we feared that the commission might collapse in its work. Yet, the 5 Democrats and Republicans prevailed in their efforts because they understood how important it was to the country for a unanimous report and to bring about the reforms to make the country safer. It was not easy, and yet they did it. And that would be my charge, certainly, to all members of this committee. The aspect of nonpartisanship is simply that you follow where the facts take you. The recommendations, every recommendation made by the commission had its roots in the facts and circumstances as uncovered by the investigation of 9/11. So bipartisanship and nonpartisanship on behalf of those measures to make the country safer are important for our country's future, and thank you for the opportunity to appear.
Thank you for that testimony. And now, Dr. Ziegert, your 5 minutes.
Thank you so much. It is a distinct and solemn honor to be with all of you today, and I want to thank and commend the committee for holding this event. I'm a professor at Stanford and Hoover Institution Senior Fellow. I've spent more than 20 years examining intelligence challenges, and I want to share with you some of the things I found and some of the information from a new book I have out on intelligence and technology called Spies, Lies, and Algorithms. Let me focus on 2 questions. The first is, what have we learned since 9/11? The second is, what intelligence challenges do we face now? I'm going to commit an unnatural act for a professor, which is to summarize my research in just 2 words. Organization matters. The root causes of failures like 9/11 lie in organizations, not individual screw-ups. And by organizations, I mean the structures, the cultures, and the incentives that lead good people to make bad decisions. Organizations are the dark matter of the policy universe. Everyone knows they're there, they're invisible, and they powerfully affect everything. 9/11, we know, was a surprise attack that should not have been a surprise. Evidence clearly shows, evidence from the 9/11 Commission in particular, and the Congressional Joint Inquiry, clearly shows that US intelligence agencies saw the terrorist threat coming, and yet they still couldn't stop it. The question is why? The answer I found is that these organizations failed to adapt to the end of the Cold War. They were hardwired with structures and cultures and incentives designed for a different enemy from a bygone era. Budgets, for example, continued pouring money into technological platforms that were very good at counting Soviet warheads from space, instead of human intelligence efforts better suited for penetrating terrorist groups on the ground. I found that although the FBI declared terrorism its #1 priority years before 9/11, in 2001, only 6% of FBI personnel, 6%, were working counterterrorism issues. FBI special agents on 9/11 received more time for vacation than counterterrorism training. Organizational weaknesses I found led the CIA and the FBI to miss 23 different opportunities to penetrate the plot and possibly stop the attack. Among them, we now know CIA officers identified 2 suspected terrorists attending an Al-Qaeda planning meeting in Malaysia, but didn't notify the FBI or the State Department for over a year. Why? Well, the answer is that they had never needed to share that information before. Until 9/11, there was no formal training, no process, no priority given to warning other government agencies about dangerous terrorists who might travel to the US. When the CIA finally did tell the FBI 19 days before 9/11 about these 2 suspected terrorists, the Bureau designated its manhunt routine, the lowest priority, and gave it to a rookie agent, just finished his first year. This too was not a mistake. This was standard operating procedure. For the FBI, catching perpetrators of past crimes had always taken higher priority than preventing a future possible disaster. We now know, of course, that the two terrorists were hiding in plain sight in San Diego, using their true names on everything from rental agreements to credit cards. At one point, they lived with an FBI informant. The hijackers didn't need clever schemes or secret identities to succeed. They needed the CIA and the FBI to operate as they always had in the Cold War. Organizations matter. What intelligence challenges do we face today? Well, I agree with my distinguished panelists that we are much safer today than we were on 9/11. Since that time, our intelligence agencies have been reformed and retooled to combat terrorism, producing some significant successes, including the operation against Osama bin Laden. But the threat landscape never sleeps. The intelligence community has mastered the Al-Qaeda problem, but Al-Qaeda is now not the only problem confronting the United States. Our threat landscape has never been more complex. The key dangers today are driven by technology in particular, artificial intelligence, the internet, biotechnology, and more. These technologies are profoundly changing the threat landscape. They are changing global economics and politics. They are empowering old adversaries in new ways and unleashing new threats. In cyberspace, our enemies now can attack us across vast distances without firing a shot, hacking not only our machines, but also our minds and how we think about each other. This cyber era brings another moment of reckoning akin to 9/11. Intelligence agencies face another adaptation imperative. They must harness the explosion of open source information and the power of technology to provide decision advantage. I want to thank the committee and I look forward to your questions and our discussion.
Thank you, Doctor, for your testimony and for everybody participating today. It was a dark day in our history, and one of the reasons I enjoy being on this committee is being able to work in a bipartisan fashion to make sure something like that never happens again. We will begin our round of questioning with myself, and then we will alternate between members. But I also want to take a moment to thank everybody who works for the Department of Homeland Security day in and day out to make sure that another 9/11 doesn't happen, along with our intelligence agencies. So the first question is for all our panelists is, in your years of experience and study, what is the most important thing you have learned about 9/11 and our country's response? And maybe we'll start in reverse order. Dr. Ziegert, with you.
Thanks very much for the question. I think the most important thing we've learned is that the organizational plumbing has to be right. If you recall, immediately after 9/11, a lot of the criticism was about individuals, whether it was criticizing the Bush administration or the Clinton administration. And what we found after 9/11 was that our intelligence community in particular wasn't organized in a way to give us a fighting chance of success. That's one of the lessons I think the 9/11 Commission was so instrumental in teaching the American people and led to fundamental reforms of our intelligence community.
Great. Dr. Kojum, Mr. Kojum?
I would agree with Dr. Ziegert here that I served in the intelligence community before, during, after 9/11, and after the reforms from the commission became law and were implemented. And the changes in the community are profound. And the integration of the agency's work, intelligence sharing is vastly improved, and that sharing is best with respect to counterterrorism. And the culture of the institutions has changed profoundly and in a positive direction. So I concur with what Dr. Ziegert has said.
Thank you. Mr. Graf?
I would actually concur with both of the my colleagues on the panel today, that I think the organization matters, and the structure and the mission matters. I think one of the things that when I look at the threat landscape today, my day job is running the cybersecurity initiative at the Aspen Institute, and Dr. Ziegert and I actually do a lot of work on cybersecurity issues these days. One of the things that I really worry about is that the cyber landscape to me looks a lot like the counterterrorism landscape did before 9/11, and that despite years of conversations and platitudes about a cyber 9/11, a cyber Pearl Harbor, when you look at the breadth of the reorganization and the rethinking of government that we did after 9/11 to combat counterterrorism, we are not seeing anything nearly that robust, that thoughtful, or within an order or two of magnitude as we face the cyber threat going forward. And so I worry a lot about the fact that we learned the lessons of 9/11 narrowly in the context of counterterrorism, and not broadly in terms of how we reposition to meet emerging threats.
Thank you. Dr. Byman, anything you want to add?
Very briefly, one lesson that's clear to me in the post 9/11 era is that it's actually quite easy to overestimate the bad guys. We now know a huge amount about Al Qaeda and associated groups, and the vast majority of information we've gained shows they're actually much weaker than many of our initial estimates were. And I think there's always a danger when you're surprised and when something bad happens to assume the worst is going to be around the corner. When in fact the United States really spent several years worrying about problems that actually were not there. And that's understandable. I myself worried about them. I don't want to point fingers at other people, but I think it's an important lesson for us to consider as we explore what new challenges we might be facing.
Thank you, Dr. Byman. With that, I will turn it over to Ranking Member Keko for your 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And first, I want to thank all of you for being here. And a quick personal story. I was a prosecutor in Puerto Rico for many years. And my sister-in-law and her friends would come down. They were flight attendants at American Airlines, would have dinner at our house often. And two of her friends were on the 9/11 flight, the first class flight attendants on the 9/11 flight that crashed into the World Trade Center. So there's not many people in the New York area who don't have a personal story like that. So it's real, and it's real even 20 years later to me. One of the things I'm concerned about is that history has a tendency to repeat itself if you're not a student of history. And we are now back to a pre-9/11 footing in Afghanistan, not having boots on the ground, not having intelligence, Taliban in control, Al Qaeda is there, and ISIS-K is there, amongst others. And I do have a concern that China and or Russia will use that opening in Afghanistan to encourage and perhaps clandestinely fund terrorist activity against us back here in the homeland. And then I overlay all that concern with the current state of our southern border. And, we've had classified briefings that we're not at liberty to discuss here, but I will point to what Customs and Border Patrol chief has said on his way out the door, that terrorists, known and suspected terrorists on the southern border are being apprehended at unprecedented levels. That's very concerning to me that our back door is open. I don't subscribe, Mr. Byman, to your thing that to your theory that the terrorists and many of these groups we've overrated their power. If they have an opportunity to exploit a weakness with us, they're going to do it. And if were it not for the heroic efforts of law enforcement and military over the last 20 years, we wouldn't be in much worse shape than we are now. The bad guys are still there. The bad guys still hate the U.S. And the bad guys love nothing more than to see mayhem created in the U.S. Overlay with all that, Mr. Graff, what you're pointing to, and I think, quite frankly, is very accurate. and that is the cyber landscape now looks a lot like pre-9/11. And I guess I want to talk about that going forward. We spend an awful lot of time in Homeland Security looking at the cyber landscape, and I subscribe to your view that it is, we're not doing anywhere near enough. And the new type of modern warfare that we could encounter, other than the stuff I've already articulated, is a cyber attack that hits our critical, whatever, systemically important critical infrastructures. And so I want to hear from you a little bit about what we should be doing more in that realm based on your background and expertise. And Ms. Ziegert, I'd like to ask you to follow up on that as well. Mr. Graff first.
Sure. I think some of it, it is much like thinking about our solutions after 9/11. There is no one single solution. What I would suggest instead is to look at the level and breadth of reorganization, the funding, the personnel that we surged, and sort of compare that to where we are today. So, look at 9/11, which, you all know, and some of my colleagues on the panel know even better than I do, the breadth and the changes that we implemented after 9/11, the creation of the Director of National Intelligence, the creation of the entire Department of Homeland Security, the growth of FBI Joint Terrorism Task Forces across the country, the billions, if not tens of billions of dollars that we poured into local and state emergency preparedness and police grants across the country. I mean, down to 1,000 MRAPs that we delivered to sheriffs and state police and local police departments across the country. You look by comparison at the work that we have done in meeting the cyber threat, and it pales in comparison. CISA, which congratulations to the committee and to Congress for actually creating that as an agency, dedicated within DHS. But CISA's as a full staff protecting the entire country and the civilian, cybersecurity and infrastructure security of the civilian side of government. CISA's staff is roughly equivalent to the cybersecurity staff of a single Wall Street bank. The total personnel that we have dedicated there is roughly equivalent to what JP Morgan employs for cybersecurity experts to protect it as a bank. You look at the Secret Service, which before 9/11 actually was one of the nation's top cyber law enforcement agencies. It's doing less cyber today than it was, a few years ago. And I think we just have to think about this in terms of the order and magnitude of the scale of the response that we are trying to meet, rather than sort of, one silver bullet solution here.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Ziegert, I'm sorry if I didn't pronounce your name right.
That's okay. Close enough, Congressman. So I agree with much of what Garrett said. I would just add a couple of points. Number one, I think it's a much more complex problem than counterterrorism after 9/11. And the reason it's more complex is that the private sector plays a much different role. So the private sector is both victim and threat vector. And so the solutions have to engage a whole of society approach with private sector firms that view cybersecurity as a cost center, not as national defense. That is a fundamental challenge in cybersecurity that we have to work through. Second, I would say, just a foot stomp, a point that Garrett made, there are more people in the US protecting our national parks than there are in CISA protecting our critical infrastructure. So we are woefully undersourced. Despite the wonderful work this committee has done, we have so much more to do to improve our footing in cybersecurity. And the third point I'd make gets to talent. One of the things that we're talking about that worked so well after 9/11 is we surged talent and developed expertise in counterterrorism. The war for talent in cybersecurity is real, and we see a real shortage of talent with cyber literate people. And we also see, if you look at Cyber Command, which is doing a lot of excellent work, no psychologists playing fundamental roles. We're talking about information warfare in cyberspace, not just hacking machines. We need to understand how our foreign adversaries are using our cyber systems to divide us and polarize us without spending much money or firing a shot. We need different expertise, not just military and technical expertise, but psychology experts to help us wage information warfare to protect the nation.
So superb comments from both of you. Thank you very much, and I yield back. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Ranking Member Katko. And with this, I see Chairman Thompson. We'll turn it back over to you, sir.
Thank you very much, Chairwoman Barragan, for stepping in. I apologize, but as you know, we're kind of managing something called Hurricane Ida down here in the northern part of my area. So let me thank the presenters for today. One of the things we are tasked with as a committee is our oversight function as we look at what goes on. A lot of times we are after the fact. So we put 9/11, after 9/11, we put a commission together to look at some things. And you know, the threat landscape continues to change. It was an international terrorist threat that we were primarily responding to. If we talk to our intelligence gathering agencies now, they are telling us that threat landscape is now more of a domestic nature. And so what we are now having to do is to put that in place. Have you all had an opportunity in your review of literature or this issue to come up with some of what you think the threat landscape is as of now? And I'll take Dr. Beinman, and we'll go down from him.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. That question, of course, you're going to get different answers depending on which data people review. To focus on terrorism groups, I'm someone who's written extensively on both jihadist groups, but also right-wing and white supremacist groups. And in my mind, there's no question that today in the United States, the right-wing and white supremacist violence is a much greater risk. Part of that, as Mr. Kako said, is that the United States has devoted a lot of resources to fighting jihadist terrorism overseas and done so very successfully. And the people at the CIA and the NSA and other places have helped keep us safe. I strongly agree with that. But we were very late to the game as the right-wing threat started to surge. And also making this more difficult because it's in the United States, much of the effort needs to be done at the state and local level. It's a different sort of coordination. It's a different sort of resource allocation. Making it more complex, of course, is the interaction of violence with broader political issues in the United States. And all this makes it not only a complex counterterrorism problem, but a complex political problem. And if I were highlighting an issue on the terrorism front, that would be the one I would highlight.
Thank you. Mr. Graff?
So I would agree with what Mr. Byman is saying, and I would add sort of one additional challenge as we look at the rising threat from white nationalists and white supremacists is that had, until relatively recently, I mean, it's obviously a challenge that the United States has struggled with for 250 years, if not longer. But what we now see in that realm is a globalization and a knitting together of the white supremacist, white nationalist movements around the country in a way that technology has enabled them to inspire one another and draw upon the examples of one another. And you see that in instances like the Charleston church shooting, the shooting in Norway, the shooting in Christchurch in New Zealand, that these are domestic terrorists in their own countries who are being inspired and sort of loosely knitted together globally in ways that a decade ago we hadn't actually seen. And so that, I think, is one of the biggest challenges going forward, is that in some ways the white nationalist threat now looks more like the Islamic threat, the Islamic extremism threat, than it did, say, 20 years ago.
Thank you. Mr. Kojam?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I certainly agree with your assessment and those of my colleagues who have spoken already. There's little doubt that the domestic terrorist threat from white nationalist and right-wing extremist groups is greater than the jihadist threat today. And the intelligence community, which I know best, really doesn't have the authorities for the domestic fight. Those powers rest with state and local governments, with prosecutors, with the Justice Department. And I think what I would add here is that prosecutors, as you know, have lots of discretion. And if they utilize these authorities, which I believe they should, it's also incumbent upon this committee and the courts as well to provide that watchdog oversight with respect to the constitutional protections for American citizens.
Thank you. Dr. Ziegert?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I agree with what my distinguished panelists have said. I'll just emphasize a couple of other points. As Mr. Kojam said, there is a seam, right? The seam today in countering terrorism, domestic terrorism, international terrorism, is NCTC, as you know, focuses on international terrorism. The FBI has jurisdiction over purely domestic terrorism. But what's purely domestic and what's foreign today? Harder to say. Those lines are blurring. And so that's a challenge for this committee and for our government to figure out how to fight a more connected terrorist threat. Secondly, I would just say that technology, as Mr. Graff said, is driving the threat landscape in ways that are unprecedented. Technology is connecting adversaries in new ways, and it's accelerating the speed at which threats develop. And I think that temporal dimension is essential. We don't have the time that we had in the Cold War to adapt our organizations. Threats are morphing much faster. So I often say John F. Kennedy had 13 days in the Cuban Missile Crisis. President Bush had 13 hours on 9/11 to figure out how to respond. Now in cyberspace, we have more like 13 minutes or 13 seconds to be able to respond. So we have to be much more nimble in our government organizations to deal with the threat landscape.
Thank you very much. I appreciate all our panelists for their response. And obviously we have been addressing some of the new challenges as a committee, and we'll continue to do that. The chair recognizes the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Bishop.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think I'm going to pass. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Green.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Like you, I was attending another event here at the Johnson Space Center, but I do want to associate myself with your question, and the responses that we received, I think, were very insightful. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I know how you appreciate people who economize with time and word. I yield back.
Thank you very much. Chair recognizes the gentlelady from Florida for 5 minutes. Well, the gentlelady is not on my screen at this point. I apologize. Is there another member who wishes to seek recognition?
I do, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman from Texas.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I'll also keep it brief. I appreciate the panelists in the discussion that we've had. Dr. Ziegert, I was very intrigued by your comments, you know, and especially mentioning your book about, I think also Dr. Graff kind of got into this about repositioning our ability to predict what's next. And I'd like to hear your thoughts, Dr. Ziegert, on what we see. We hear this over the horizon discussion. I got to tell you, as an F-22 pilot and somebody who commanded the largest tactical intelligence unit in the Middle East, I don't know what they're talking about. This over the horizon ability to monitor what's going on in Afghanistan with 4,000 to 5,000 folks who were released. Mr. Chairman, thank you for the comments on oversight. Couldn't agree more. We must have oversight on the folks who were released from those prisons, the country of origin, the numbers, what their affiliations are with any terror group. So Dr. Ziegert, can you kind of give me your thoughts on how this looks so we can prevent another 9/11 from happening? I'm very concerned about this.
Well, Congressman, I'm not going to get into an argument with the F-22 pilot about what over the horizon means. I will say this. I think you've so eloquently stated what the challenge is, right? We've all discussed the more complex threat landscape. How do we anticipate the threats of the future so that we can protect the nation from surprise attack, right? Or from strategic surprise, whether or not it's an attack. And that job's getting harder. I will say this. I think that as we think about how do we understand the drivers of the threat landscape, I think the intelligence community faces 5 fundamental challenges, right? The first we've talked about, which is more threats enabled by technology. The second is more speed. We haven't talked about the other 3. Number 3, more data, right? We're drowning in data in the intelligence community. So how can we give our agencies the tools to make better sense of this explosion of data on Earth? The fourth is more decision makers that need intelligence. Private sector leaders now need intelligence. Voters need intelligence to know about foreign election interference. That's a dramatic new world compared to what it was even 5 years ago. And finally, more competitors. The intelligence race for insight or decision advantage, whether you're an F-22 pilot or the president, is getting more crowded, right? We are losing our intelligence advantage because non-state actors and other weak states can access commercial satellite imagery. Iran accessing commercial satellite imagery to strike American forces. They can access things on the open internet, and they can use these tools, simple AI algorithms available for a high school kid with no coding experience, to do the kinds of analysis that we've been doing inside our government. This is a major challenge for our intelligence community. I wish I could give you a more satisfying answer about over the horizon, but I'm afraid it's a tough nut to crack.
Well, I appreciate it, and I think you would have made an outstanding fighter pilot, because you're exactly right. The speed of relevancy by which you process threats, disseminate that information to the decision makers and those who can take effect and prevent them from reaching our own soil is so important. And I think that what we're seeing right now is a flat-footed position without the ability to do the processing, exploitation, dissemination at the speed of relevancy. So I appreciate those comments, and as a member of Homeland Security, take all of your inputs very seriously. And I don't think that we're overestimating any threat, because the resolve of forces in Afghanistan, they demonstrated their resolve last week, and 13 families are now Gold Star families. With that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Chair recognizes the gentlelady from Florida, Ms. Dimmons.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our outstanding panelists that have joined us today. Mr. Graff, I want to thank you for, I believe, helping to kind of set the stage for this discussion today by talking about the 17 minutes. On 9/11, I was serving as a police commander assigned to the Orlando International Airport, and I will never forget those 17 minutes, just as I will never forget what happened to us as a nation. I also want to also remind the members of this committee of the tremendous responsibility that we share in making sure that we are never attacked again in this vicious and cowardly way. Dr. Ziegert, you talked about that organization matters, and sometimes we have found ourselves in the past focusing more on individuals and not really the organizational vulnerabilities, if you will, that we have. I fear that after America's longest war, we seem to be slipping back into that space. Again, this is not our success or failure. It's never in the hands of one person or one period of time. And so if we're going to do what we need to do as members of, and thank you, I forget which panelist said, as one of the most powerful committees in Congress, then we do have to lay down the partisanship and really focus on the tremendous work ahead of us to provide the necessary oversight to make sure that what happened to us as a nation never happens again. That has to be our priority. I'd like to hear from any one of you. We know that when the Department of Homeland Security was established, since that time, it has gone through several changes. In order for us to meet the mission, the tremendous mission ahead of us, what additional changes would either of you recommend to the Department of Homeland Security and the role that we play as members of Congress?
Congresswoman, I would start off with an answer if none of my colleagues have one that they would immediately like to leap into. So I think that unfortunately, looking back on it, the Department of Homeland Security and the organization that was created in the wake of 9/11 stands as one of the biggest failures that the U.S. government had after 9/11. That in retrospect, with hindsight, what we can see is that DHS contains two very different sets of organizations and tools. It is sort of half a border and immigration security agency that has, immensely partisan and political sort of hot potatoes that it has to wrestle with. And also a group of incredibly important and sort of perennially overlooked and underfunded sort of nonpartisan emergency response and disaster preparedness organizations like CISA and FEMA. And I think what we see is that this is a department that is too big for one person, because the Secretary of Homeland Security is always going to be pulled towards that border and immigration security sides. That is where the personnel is, that's where the funding is, that's where the politics is. And what we have seen, and this began with Hurricane Katrina, and continues up to the FEMA that we have seen overworked and understaffed over the last couple of years amid the pandemic, is that these organizations, which Americans rely on in such important ways in moments of true crisis, don't get the attention, the oversight, the personnel, and the funding that they deserve. And I think sort of going forward, one of the most important questions for us in the Homeland Security space is whether the structure that was created under this giant umbrella of the Department of Homeland Security was the right way to solve this problem. And I believe very strongly, and I've spent years and years reporting on the pervasive corruption and misconduct, particularly inside Customs and Border Protection, that it is still struggling with after its post 9/11 hiring surge. Something that saw CBP officers and Border Patrol agents arrested on an almost daily basis for the better part of a decade, from 2009 to 2017. This is something where we are sort of failing to provide the level of oversight and the level of political focus that we need in order to make this department work going forward.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I cannot see the clock, but are there any other panelists who would like to add to that question?
I'll chime in briefly. Two things. First of all, when we look at threat assessments, whether they're CIA threat assessments or other agencies, the way the Department of Homeland Security allocates its internal resources don't match up. And that's a very basic function, which is ensuring that more dangerous threats have more resources And instead, we end up with legacies where certain threats that were bigger 5, 10, 15 years ago still continue to have too many resources. And that to me is a very important oversight function, is simply highlighting that and pressing various agencies on this. The second thing is, uh, I know on the intelligence side, I suspect other areas, the Department of Homeland Security is incredibly dependent on contractors. And you can't build institutional resource depth from a contractor base, right? You need that ability to have kind of permanent staff. And that made sense several years after 9/11 when everything was jumbled and you were rushing to do things. 15 years after DHS is created, there's no excuse. So there need to be more permanent employees who can have institutional wisdom and have a loyalty to the place.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you very much. Gentlelady yields back. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Jimenez, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Thank you so much. And as I'm not an F-22 pilot, but I was a former firefighter and somebody who lost 343 brothers on 9/11 and a personal friend. 9/11 is personal to me. And so one thing I want to ask, there's a couple of things I want to ask. Number one, I think a lot of people attributed the lack of action by our agencies on that day, and to the perpetrators, to the fact that there were firewalls put up between agencies prohibiting them from actually sharing information. And a lot of those were knocked down. Have any of you seen the reestablishment of those kind of walls where agencies are not communicating with each other anymore?
I'm happy to respond to your question. The answer is no, as best I know it. That really, this is a success story within the U.S. government of information sharing and collaboration across agencies. Now, it's never perfect. It can always be better, but it is surely much, much improved since 9/11 and the reforms that have taken place. The other point I would just add is that the biggest problem on 9/11, and Mr. Graff has referred to it, was just simply situational awareness. We never really understood what was happening that day until long after the events had transpired. And that the uniqueness of the actions and the lack of situational awareness just paralyzed action across the board.
Okay, thank you. The second question that I have is that we talk a lot about now right-wing extremist groups, but last summer I was the mayor of Miami-Dade County, and when we were looking at the protests for the Floyd, murder at the hands of a police officer, we knew that there are also left-wing extremists that actually come down to Miami to try to agitate. Antifa being that. It looks to me like they're well funded and they're also well coordinated. What are the risks posed by Antifa, the far left extremist groups, to terrorism here in the United States?
So
Anybody want to answer that?
I'm happy to take a stab. So my sense from talking to government officials and talking to people on the outside as well as my own research is the Antifa threat is far less than the right-wing threat. It's not zero, right? There are thugs, they like to fight. A lot of Antifa is actually about doxing people on the internet, revealing personal information as a way of causing them harm. And you do have provocateurs, so this is not, a figment of people's imagination. However, it's grossly exaggerated. And often you see conspiracy theories involving Antifa that are demonstrably false, or in many cases really blow the rollout proportions. So I think it's important for DHS and for the members of this committee to be tracking really, killers regardless of what they believe. And there have been times in American history when left-wing violence was the top threat in terms of terrorism. But I don't believe now is one of them. And I think the danger is far graver, especially when you look at the white supremacist world.
So those images we saw of these young men and women in helmets and throwing Molotov cocktails and with sticks and all that, that's just not a big threat.
Not as big, right? Threats are relative. And so we have to look at the dangers we face, and we have to understand how many members they have, the types of tactics they're doing, how many people they're killing. And all that, it's far less. We see far more people dying. And to me, that's the number one measure when we look at the white supremacist side. So that's where my focus is. That's why, understandably, after 9/11, we focused on jihadist terrorism because they'd killed so many Americans. And so I think we need to recognize that while people with sticks who are beating people up are bad people and deserve the full penalty of the law, that's not going to pose the same threat as individuals who are going into black churches and shooting people. And that's a much bigger danger. We need to recognize that.
No, that I agree with that, but I think both sides need to be looked at as a threat. Thank you, I appreciate it. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. I don't see any other members seeking recognition. Let me thank our panelists for helping us look back. I thank them for their research as well as their comments. I think it's important for us as we move forward to look at those past 20 years because as all have indicated, the threat landscape has changed. The people who cause us significant concern have modified how they do things. So we have to equally adjust ourselves accordingly. The comment about legacy organizations within DHS is not falling on deaf ears, I assure you. The fact that the cyber threat in this era that we operate from now is real. The fact that we cannot find enough people to put in the cyber arena on the federal payroll, we recognize, therefore we have that over reliance on contractors. We hold job fairs, we encourage it, but we just haven't gotten there. So the FEMA issue is real. I'm in the midst of a hurricane situation here, and I know when you have a 50-state declaration, and on top of that, wildfires, hurricanes, floods, it just there are only so many directions you can pull so many people in at one time, and I'm in full view of the difficulty associated with it. And at some point, I talked to the administrator of FEMA yesterday about what we need to do, and we will address it. If any of the presenters have any suggestions, please feel free to pass them along to us. There's no pride in this. There's no Democrat, Republican issue when those issues occur. Those American citizens that we need to help them at that most vulnerable moment. So again, let me thank the panelists. Let me thank the members who participated, and the roundtables are joined. Thank you very much.